So, how did America become Murica? Now, one thing I have to specify is that I don't hate America. I actually like many aspects of America, but I do hate Murica. And I think we really need to look at the history and see how Murica in its present day form came to be. And I don't think all of America is Murica. Like when I go to places like Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia, or Boston, like I don't think those places are Murica. I don't think the national parks out west are Murica either. I think what Murica is, it's not just a place, but it's a state of mind and it's also an ideology. And I think to define what it is, you really have to look at America's history. And I think one unfortunate thing is that many conservatives in America now, they're not trying to preserve America. They are trying to preserve Murica. And it is also true, unfortunately, about many conservatives across the Western world in countries other than America, is that they're trying to replicate Murica in their own countries and conserve it there. And as I've said many times, like, I don't think America can be single-handedly blamed for promoting liberalism across the globe with things like multiculturalism, mass immigration, feminism, LGBTism, because I think a lot of that is an outgrowth of a more general trend that was happening in the 20th century across the entire Western world. And it's entirely possible that if it hadn't been America promoting these things, it would have been some other country. It could have been France, could have been the UK. Well, I mean, the UK did play a big role. But yeah, it could have been France. To an extent, Soviet Russia also promoted some of these things. But nonetheless, I do think there are certain aspects of the hellishness of the modern world that are uniquely American, or more accurately, uniquely Murican. I think SUV culture, like SUVs and pickup trucks, being aggressively promoted as this vehicle that every motorist needs to own. This idea that everybody needs to live in suburbia. And this idea that everybody needs to constantly eat unhealthy fast food from major global chains. I think those are uniquely American concepts that all stem from corporations in the United States, but sadly are now aggressively promoted by regular Americans, but including, sadly, especially conservatives and those who identify as right-wingers. So, what is America historically? I think America was really founded on ideals such as individual freedom, which, to be honest, I don't support unconditionally. And I do think there's heavy, like, significant problems with what it says in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Like, for instance, saying all men are created equal. I don't think that is true on any level. In terms of both equality of outcome or equality of opportunity, I don't think everybody is on a fair playing field. I don't think it's even possible to create a society like that. Nor do I think every person is of equal value. So, I mean, like, that statement right off the bat, I disagree with. I also disagree with the more general idea of that the individual should supersede the collective good and that individual freedom is always of paramount importance. That being said, even though America was founded on these ideas in theory, I think in practice, America didn't always live up to them, which was actually a good thing. Because rather than more freedom, there was actually a sense of order. Like, you had cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. itself, which were built in traditional European styles with a lot of beautiful architecture. So rather than reflecting the vulgar tastes of the masses as suburbia now reflects, these cities were actually built in a more traditional and a more collectivist style. So again, like, those places to me are America. Those are not Murica. And sadly, the places that are still America are now overwhelmingly dominated by liberals, although not entirely. Like Charleston, South Carolina is probably less bad than some of the other places. And some of these cities in southeastern Pennsylvania, not Philadelphia itself, but places like Reading, Allentown, Bethlehem, um, Harrisburg. Like I don't know, they're kind of in between, but they're not like terribly shit libby. But they still have some elements of traditional architecture and traditional style community. So again, like there are places where the old America kind of still exists, but unfortunately, like yes, there is a preponderance of shit libs in these places often, which is unfortunate. And there does seem to be a correlation, maybe even a causation to some extent, where I think America has become fractured, where the right has become so aggressively individualist that they scorn more traditional places. But yeah, I mean, those older places are what I see as America. And also, I think the national parks, because the national parks embody this idea of conservationism and a collective determination to preserve these wilderness areas for the enjoyment of the public. Not to mention they are, government owned and government funded. Although in my opinion, not funded enough sometimes. Like sometimes they're a bit underfunded. The national parks, the state parks, national monument, national conservation area, what have you, like all these government funded and protected wilderness areas. Like these types of places, which are often the types of places that tourists want to see when they come to America, those are America. Those are not Murica. Although some tourist destinations I think are Murica. Like I think Las Vegas is definitely Murica. I think Miami is arguably Murica. I think Orlando, Florida, with its theme parks, is Murica. Los Angeles, I think, it's mostly Murica, but with elements of America sprinkled in, because you do have some very good art museums in Los Angeles. But yes, by and large, like there is a difference between America and Murica, but I would dispute the idea that like America is just for tourists and Murica is the real America, because I do think some Murican places are also very popular among tourists. And of course, places like Myrtle Beach and some of these spring break destinations. Like, I'm not talking about historic cities like New Orleans or Savannah or Charleston or St. Augustine, which are very much America. I'm talking about like the more modernist places, or like the Jersey Shore for that matter. Those are all Murica for sure. But yeah, how did Murica come to exist? Well, I think a big part of it was Murica was essentially born in the 1950s. And the idealization of the 1950s is essentially, I think, this idealization of when Murica was born and when it existed in a slightly more wholesome state than its present day state. But nonetheless, I do think it was born then. And I think the defining features of Murica are corporatization, mass consumption, mass production, and car dependence. Like, I think those are some of the foremost characteristics of it. The 1950s was essentially when the streetcar lines were ripped out, the passenger train the passenger train service was gutted, and everything became completely dependent around the automobile. Large swaths of the historic inner cities were destroyed to accommodate the automobile and to accommodate suburbanites. Parking lots were built everywhere. Historic buildings were destroyed so that parking lots could be built, and also so that roads could be widened and freeways could be built to accommodate suburban commuters. The suburbs themselves, like beginning with Levittown on Long Island, the suburbs just exploded across the United States and became the dominant way of life. And there was this really strong belief that, oh, anyone who's anyone lives in the suburbs. And it became like the big trend in the 50s and 60s and onward into the 70s and 80s. Now, I think there's other aspects to Murica also. Like, I think it's very much tied with fast food and fast food mega corporations like McDonald's, KFC, Burger King, Pizza Hut. And it's also tied to like like strips, like stroads with like ugly strips of commercial buildings, like in that famous Breezewood photograph that people always post. And people are like, oh, that's just a truck stop. It's like, shut the hell up. Yes, that is just a truck stop, but there's places like that in basically every city, every municipality across the United States and Canada too. Like when I talk about Murica, much of Murica exists in Canada also. Like there are very Murican places and just elements of Murican culture within Canadian culture. I'd say it's a bit less ubiquitous here, but there are definitely places within Canada that are extremely American. It's just probably not as high a percentage of our population or our settled areas are like that here. But I'd say more so out west. Like there's a lot of like places in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta that are very American. I would also say some parts of Ontario, like some parts of Western Ontario toward Michigan, and also the Ottawa Valley west of Ottawa. I would say those areas are quite American in Ontario. But yeah, I would say the most American part of Canada is definitely Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And as I've said, Americanism does correlate with conservative voting, unfortunately, although not entirely, because there are some places that are liberal voting that are very American. Like Las Vegas is definitely a blue city. It is extremely American. It could be the most American city in existence. It's just a decadent. It is basically one massive tribute to the ideology of Americanism. It is tacky. It is over the top. It's a city that just gives me bad vibes. The only thing I really like about Vegas is some of the national parks nearby are really beautiful, like Red Rock and Valley of Fire. Well, that's technically a national conservation area and a state park, but whatever. But the city itself is just a monument to hideousness. It's a monument to the worst aspects of Americanism. But anyway, yeah. I think another aspect of Murica is how in the 1950s, a lot of the laws were changed so that the government would subsidize major corporations and promote major corporations at the expense of smaller businesses, and would allow them to gain massive monopolies, like controlling the food industry. Like the documentary Food Inc. goes into a lot of detail on this, as does the book Fast Food Nation, about how, you know, a few major corporations have come to dominate America's food supply, both in terms of fast food, like restaurant food, but also grocery store food, and how a lot of this is just extremely unhealthy food, and that is by design to keep people addicted, and also because in some ways it's cheaper and easier to mass produce that way. And that was a big part of the general ideology of the 1950s, this uncritical belief in mass production, this idea that we will just mass produce and mass market everything and it will be glorious, and it's the way of the future, the way of progress. Mass automation, mass production. On the assembly lines, we will build automobiles and we will create food that is affordable for the average American, allowing people to enter into a new era of prosperity. But the truth is, it was actually a new era of obesity and poor health and diabetes, and also a new era of everywhere starting to feel the same, because everywhere you go, there's the same corporations, the same fast food chains, the same ugly visual environments of chain stores and 6-lane stroads, and just no sidewalks, of course. Like, oh, we can't have pedestrians. Fuck them. Fuck you if you want to walk anywhere. Like, people will actually honk at you for walking on the sides of these roads as if you're not supposed to. And that says a lot. So, I mean, yeah, that to me is peak Murica. Like, that is what Murica is. And frankly, it's an abomination. It's an abomination upon the face of the earth. But And also another aspect that it says car dependence and the arms race of vehicles just getting bigger and bigger, mirroring, of course, the arms race of people getting bigger and bigger. Got to have bigger vehicles for bigger people. And yeah, I mean, all this, unfortunately, America does export to other countries. Like they push it on Europe, and I've seen it firsthand when I'm in Europe how these things are growing there. Like the people are growing, and there's more and more fast food mega chains. There's more and more SUVs. Not so much pickup trucks. I haven't seen that take off yet in Europe, but usually the SUVs come first, and then the pickup trucks follow. It's kind of the next stage in the vehicular arms race, and Europe's not quite there yet, but I guarantee they will be eventually. And yeah, I mean, it's just tacky and ugly, as I think one of the main problems with it. But yeah, in spite of this, is all of America Murica? No. I mean, you can still find plenty of places in America that don't fit this mold. Like I would say, obviously, some of the big cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, Baltimore, although Baltimore has severe crime problems. San Francisco, but San Francisco has its own problems that we're all very well aware of. I mean, all these cities have problems to varying extents, and they do tend to be more liberal. And also, again, there's some of those cities in southeastern Pennsylvania that I mentioned that are perhaps less architecturally spectacular, but still nice, like Harrisburg and Allentown, Bethlehem, Hershey, Reading, also Frederick, Maryland. Like there's some smaller towns that are Newport, Rhode Island. Again, like some of these places, they vary in terms of like crime rate and demographics and things like that. But again, like these places show that there are plenty of places in the U.S. that are not America. But again, like these places do have their own different problems, unfortunately. And even in these places, like they do also have their own suburbs, which do feel like America. So, I mean, America isn't everywhere, but it is like the majority of the country. And I think what's the problem is this is the America that conservatives want to preserve. And again, I would define it in terms of like low culture generally, because I do think part of America is like shitty music, like pop music, rap music, and country music all being kind of lowest common denominator. Like I kind of feel like rap music is to the city what pop music is to the suburbs, and which is what country music is to the country, like the rural areas. Kind of like this lowest common denominator, simplistic music that tends to dominate everything. Okay, I'm not saying all pop music. Like there's some pop music that I like, but the vast majority of pop music is crap. And I would say even more so with hip hop and country. With hip hop and country, it's like 99%. Like I guess, okay, some hip hop, some stuff that's like not straight up hip hop is all right. Like hip hop derivative, like stuff like Rage Against the Machine, which is more rock / metal, or like Massive Attack kind of started with hip hop roots, but really went away from that as they went on. Country music, yeah, not a fan. I mean, I like Leonard Skinner. That's the closest to country music. I like some of their songs, but they're more like classic rock anyway, with maybe a slight bit of country influence. But yeah, I mean, by and large, I mean, America, it's kind of a society based on pandering to the lowest common denominator, to this kind of like vulgar populist culture of the masses. And it's all about disdaining high culture, like hating things like traditional art or traditional architecture or any kind of restaurant that isn't like McDonald's, hating public transit, hating walkable cities, like hating any movie that's like more intelligent than Transformers, hating any music that has the slightest bit of complexity to it or is the slightest bit different or weird or innovative. Yeah, I mean, it's just this lowest common denominator culture, like idiocracy basically. And I hate to say it, but it is what a lot of conservatives want to conserve. Like, they want to conserve that lowest common denominator. They want to protect your freedom to modify your pickup truck so that it spews black smoke out of it, so that you can press a button and blow black smoke out of your pickup truck every time you pass an electric car. Like, what kind of idiocy is that? Like, and yes, obviously, I am not saying that this kind of lowest common denominator culture is unique to America, nor that it all stems from America. Like, for instance, European soccer hooliganism is clearly something they invented themselves, and they're responsible for that shit. America never pushed that on them. But nonetheless, like, I do think overall, when you look at this kind of lowest common denominator culture, I mean, more of it does stem from America than from any other country, both objectively and per capita. And I would say that it is an outgrowth of some of the principles that America was founded upon, like this idea of putting individual liberty above the collective good. This idea that like personal freedom is always paramount. I do think that if you give people unlimited freedom, the lowest common denominator will prevail. And I mean, again, like, I do favor freedom in some regards. Like, I favor freedom of speech. I do think that's a good thing about American culture, but I don't think that freedom of speech translates into freedom to do whatever the fuck you want. I think you should be free to say what you want, but I don't think you should be free to do what you want in every circumstance. And yeah, I mean, I guess to go back to the main topic of this video, which is like the history of Murica, another example of how it came to be in the under FDR was that after World War II, suburban home building was actually subsidized and prioritized by the government, and people were given loans for purchasing suburban homes, but only for purchasing new homes. They weren't given loans for living in existing homes. And what that basically meant was that suburban sprawl was being subsidized while existing historic buildings were being de-incentivized. Like, people were being de-incentivized from living in existing historic homes. And not only that, but a lot of laws were passed mandating, like zoning laws mandating suburban sprawl and making single family homes the only acceptable type of home in certain areas. And not only that, like, again, single family homes by themselves are not necessarily suburban sprawl, because you can have single family homes that are close together and that are built in a way so that their footprint isn't huge, and that you can still have a neighborhood that's dense enough for public transit. And you can see that in some of these historic neighborhoods, like in Charleston, South Carolina, even in parts of Toronto, where there are like homes that are technically detached but are not suburban sprawl. But again, that's not what they were promoting then. They were promoting sprawl. And yeah, I mean, I think that was a big part of how Murica came to exist also. And I think one of the most damning examples of how conservatives perpetuate this mentality is there's actually, I mean, I know this is old, it's from like 10 years ago, but there's a Pew Research study that showed that right-leaning people on average value museums less than left-leaning people in the United States by a significant margin. And it's very sad, because it's like, if you're claiming to be a conservative, like, what are you conserving if you don't value museums? Like, if you don't value our historical artifacts, like, what the fuck are you even conserving? Like, if you don't value artwork or artifacts or any of those things, like, what are you conserving? Like, it gets to a certain point where it's like you're just conserving the social norms of like your childhood. That's basically it. Like, you're trying to conserve the suburbia you were brought up in as a kid, and basically nothing else. Like, I guess on the far right, you have people who are trying to preserve their genetics, but in many cases among more mainstream conservatives, they aren't even trying to preserve that. Like they're more than happy with mass immigration and with demographic change, just as long as the suburban American way of life remains unthreatened, just as long as they still have their Big Mac and their SUV or their pickup truck and their big McMansion. So yeah, and again, I when I talk about Americanism, I'm really not trying to single out. I mean, I think it's more ubiquitous in the United States than any other country, but I think it's very ubiquitous in Canada and also Australia and New Zealand. Um, South Africa has its own variant, but in South Africa they live behind like electric fences, and it's a very different type of country there. So I try not to pick on them too much because they are frankly in a very dire situation, and I don't want to kick people who are already down. I do think in South Africa, like some people, like I actually think their society being as suburbanized as it is might actually make the overall crime rate worse, because I find that like if you compare Europe to the US, Europe has lower crime rates, at least murder rates. We don't know the rates for other types of crimes, but it's possible that South Africa's murder rate, part of the reason it's so high is because it's a suburbanized society combined with the atrocious policies of the ANC and the demographic situation there. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say in a country like that, but yeah, I mean, I would say the countries that are most Americanized overall, I would say US itself is number one. And then next would be probably either Australia or Canada and then New Zealand. I would actually say the the Middle Eastern oil rich countries on the Arabian Peninsula, like the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, they might actually in some ways be more American than America itself. Like Dubai is literally Las Vegas 2.0, even taken further. And yeah, I mean, there's strong arguments to be made that they're even worse in these regards. But I think overall, the United States pushes these kinds of values on the rest of the world more than anyone else does. And they do it through like pushing fast food. They really aggressively push fast food like McDonald's in all across the globe. They push SUVs across the globe. They market these things aggressively. And I do think the American government is partly responsible because I know if any country tries to restrict these things, it doesn't bode well for them. Like the second they start telling American corporations that they can't do whatever they want on these countries' soil, then suddenly it becomes a big diplomatic issue. So yes, I do think the American government is partly responsible for this. And by extension, anyone in America who supports what the government does in this regard. It's simply that, with great power comes great responsibility. Like, I mean, America is the most powerful country in the world. So it's like, yes, other countries do have these problems. Like Canada, Australia, New Zealand definitely have these problems. But America is ultimately the most powerful country of any country and the most powerful country with these problems. So that is partly why I think they get singled out, and partly because they were where a lot of this stuff was born. Like, I think the proliferation of SUVs, McDonald's and all the major fast food chains were born in America, except Tim Hortons. That was born in Canada. We need to take responsibility for fucking Tim Hortons. Suburbia was born in America, like with Levittown, like the current incarnation of suburbia. I mean, the automobile was invented in America, which again, I'm not begrudging them for inventing the automobile. Like, I mean, it's a good thing that cars exist. It's just not a good thing that car culture exists, like this excessive car reliance that we have today. But yes, I do think that was largely born in America. I mean, there's definitely some ways in which other countries can out Murica. Like, I actually think Canada has worse intercity passenger rail than America does. Like, Via Rail is just horrendous in so many ways. And yeah, I mean, there is that. Like, I'm not gonna claim that we can't be as bad or worse in some regards, but nonetheless, like, these issues do come from America predominantly. So That's why I single out Murica as the originators as of this ideology, which again I primarily define as like tacky, low culture, mass marketed, mass produced consumerism that feeds upon the lowest common denominator desires of the masses, and also feeds upon the idea of unlimited individual freedom for people to do what they want, buy what they want based on their lowest impulses. So yeah, and I mean, again, as I said, Las Vegas is kind of the extremity of that, because you even have gambling there, which is illegal in much of America, I think, and honestly, rightfully so. Fuck gambling, but yeah, I mean, that is, in my opinion, what Muricanism is and how it came to be.